insane how many different things are like flipping at the same time. It's like,
A quick side question
Yeah.
to that is, can the Sinic conglomeration of people actually rise with an aging population?
Great question. So you're probably talking about like Zihon's type arguments and so on and so forth, right? So,
Well, yes. I mean, I study a lot of demographics, and I understand that demographics can be solved by technology. The question is will it? Because the Chinese state is so focused on the mass of the people, as opposed to solving it by technology. I don't know.
Well, yeah. So what do I think about that? So
without going too deep down another rabbit hole, but it's just something.
It's a great question. So my short answer is robotics over demographics, right?
Yeah.
B, I think the whole thing is actually somewhat overstated because
Hold on, let's just stop that a sec. I don't think most people understand. I took it for granted because I've been thinking about this for a long time. Robotics are demographics.
Robotics
need to understand.
Yeah, so let me explain that. Robotics over demographics. What does that mean? That means like,
well, no, robotics are demographics.
Well, they are.
As is AI.
Yes.
These are demographics.
Yes. So because you can literally exactly.
These are new people.
It's new people. That's right. And so it's both, right? So robotics over or robotics are demographics are both different ways of expressing the fact that you can do more and more with fewer and fewer, or nowadays in the limit 0 people, right? With AI, right? And that just gives you a scaling that people just, they're not thinking about it because you weren't able to just crank up new people like that, right? Just to kind of think about what that curve looks like. 10 years ago, 12 guys, 14 guys did Instagram. I forget the exact number, but it was on that order. And Kodak had like 1,000x that number of people and went bankrupt. Okay. So lots of people is not necessarily an asset. It's more like a liability. It's mouths to feed. It's, folks who are stuck in old ways of doing things, right? It's just like, America's aircraft carriers are, we'll see, but like, it's a 1940s technology, literally 1940s technology. It's being upgraded and whatnot, but, drones and other things can hit it. And unmanned is better than manned. In any situation that you can do unmanned, it's usually better to do unmanned. Unmanned spaceflight, that's how space is doing it. Like unmanned warfare is easier to do for militaries that don't have don't have a culture that's built around like a guy in the tank or a guy in the plane, right? What are we putting on screen? We're putting Top Gun on screen. That's the best-selling movie. People are like, yeah, fighter pilots. You know what that's equivalent of? It's like cheering some horseback movie before the start of World War I. Okay? Like horseback cavalry. No, the point is to be like, if you're actually fighting to win, the point is...
Interesting enough, in Top Gun, they even mentioned this.
Oh, really?
It's like, this is the last hurrah of the fighter pilot.
Right.
Because the drones win.
Yeah, drones win. Right. But the thing is that basically... so I haven't watched the movie yet, or whatever. And look,
it's not worth watching. But you know what the movie's about.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I'm not trying to be a buzzkill or anything. Like, look, I appreciate that nostalgia kind of thing as much as anybody else or whatever. But you have to sort of envision the future to be able to build it. And one of the biggest problems actually with a lot of cinema and so on, there's a key stolen base. Do you know what's in common among all these dystopian sci-fi things? Is the stolen bases, they implicitly assume the present was like, okay, good enough, right? And some tech guy, whether it's like Miles Dyson from Terminator, or it's like, the evil scientist is unnamed in Gattaca, but the technology is like, there's some tech guy who came in, Black Mirrored it all up, okay, and disturbed our Garden of Eden. It's like literally the Christian fall. We had this sort of Edenic present. It was okay. It was fine. And now it's screwed up, right? And so the stolen base is that the present is good. But the alternative kind of stories that I want to tell, and I think the different way of thinking about it is, what if it is the present that is dystopian, right? What if it's a present which has supply chain shortages and rising nationalism and anarchy?
And it's also the helical structure you were talking about, right? It's not mean reversion. We're seeing this. It's a particularly prevalent narrative in the Republicans right now, and the Conservative Party in the UK, which is to go back to the 1950s.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And you want to kind of turn the clock all the way around, right? That's actually the smarter way of doing it, is identify the changes that are happening and figure out how to ride the lightning and pull it all the way through, right? And that's difficult to do, by the way. And it's just the kind of thing where it may be somebody who's placed in a certain way can do and see that, and others can't. Civilizations have a life cycle as well. It's like breathe in, breathe out, right? Like just like that.
What's interesting now, to get us back into the network state, is once you have a group of people who have kind of a joint vision, it can get there without a single person getting it there.
So this is complicated. I think you need both the founder and the community. You need both.
I agree.
Right?
We can see it with some elements of cryptocurrency, and we've seen it with technology, open source technology, where it just kind of happens because the genie's out of the box and it sets the direction because it exists.
Well, it's interesting. It's one of these things where it is true. There's something to the Victor Hugo concept of nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. There is something to that. Okay. But, one way I reconcile this, is let's call it reconciling the great man theory of history with the impersonal forces theory of history. Okay. Because there's kind of two different ways. So, it's great men, they steer it. No, it's impersonal forces. Anybody could have done it. Right. Sort of a good natural experiment for resolving this is like, I'll give two arguments, but like the Newton-Leibniz argument, okay? If there was somebody else who was doing the same thing at roughly the same time, you can argue that great man theory is less applicable because the idea was in the air, right? If it's something that basically nobody else was working on, and arguably Satoshi was like that, there wasn't anybody else who was shipped something just like Bitcoin around the same time. It took 5 years before Vitalik shipped Ethereum. And he was certainly, he's, amazing and deserves all the credit, but it was inspired by Satoshi's work, right? And would not have happened without Satoshi's work. So it's not like there were lots of other people working on it. So the way I'm thinking about it is, the way I integrate the impersonal forces of history and the great man theory is the tech tree model from like civilization, okay? There's all these things that are known, okay? Let's call that our knowledge base. And that's like the base of the tree. And then you can decide to extend it in this direction or this direction, like the branches. As an individual, you can go to one of these branches and you push the frontier forward on that branch. You see what I'm saying? So that has room for both structural constraints, right? As great as Satoshi was, he wasn't going to invent internal combustion engines and mining and aviation and rocketry. He wasn't going to invent all that from scratch, right? He did need to stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Even Newton had to stand on the shoulders of giants, right? There's all of these prerequisites that existed before. That's like the base of the tech tree. But then you can choose to extend it in one direction. And that, I think, is sort of like the helical theory, where it acknowledges both points of view as legitimate and gives you an overall framework in which to see it that leads to interesting deductions, which is, it means, for example, that you can literally enumerate the tech tree. This is actually one of the things I do as an investor. I literally enumerate the tech tree for an area as much as I can, and I add to it. And I'm like, we should see a guy there. And then you hunt, and if you can't hunt, you incubate, right? And this is like a useful way of thinking. It's a little more like Thiel's model of the optimistic and determinate future. He has like, pessimistic, optimistic, indeterminate, determinate, like so, and there's 2 by 2, right? This is in a sense optimistic and determinate, but decentralized, where it's like, I know there should be a solution in this specific determined area, but I don't know exactly what it is. However, I have narrowed it down. I'm not searching the entire possible set. It's like, there's an identity thing that should look like this. And you write up a spec and you put it out into the world, and you're not just the idea guy, you're the idea plus capital guy, and then you see if you can fund it. Okay. So what's my point? Coming back up. So basically, can these things, these networks you ask, can they exist totally independent of, a founder? I think the founder's energy is needed to get them started. And then they can like that kind of pulls the Triforce together. And then they can sort of decay over time, but it might take a long time for them to decay. They still maintain some of the initial shape that the founder set, but eventually they don't resemble what that happened.
Well, founder mythology generally needs to maintain. So the founding fathers is one of the mythology of the United States. They don't exist anymore, and they probably would not fit into the current present state, but it's a mythology that helps organize people. Same with Steve Jobs. He's now a mythology, and it still organizes people around.
Mid-2020, the fact that George Washington statues and so on were all pulled down, right? That, and then yet 6 months later, the Capitol, so you have something where it's a little bit like the Soviet Union, where the Orthodox Church some of these big churches were like dynamited, blown up, turned into swimming pools, desecrated, to show that there was a new boss in town, like a new state. The state was respected, but not the cultural institutions, right?
That's very common, right? Almost every civilization does this.
Yes, at some point, that's right. But the thing is that when you do that, you're cutting ties with a huge part of what your society thinks they had signed on for, right? So that gets to your other remark, right? You talked about freedom, right? This is the emerging, that blue and red cluster that we saw there in that graph, right? The emerging second cluster, which is not emerging, but like a lot of things coming together. It is Bitcoin maximalist plus, very stridently anti-lockdown and anti-vax plus, don't tread on me plus pro-gun plus this and that. Like a lot of that stuff is coming together into in a crypto-anarchist kind of worldview, right? Now, there's aspects of this that at least the words I'm sympathetic to, okay? Just like I'm actually sympathetic to some of the words that the U.S. establishment uses. Do I want equal treatment under the law? Of course I want equal treatment under the law, right? But that is very different than operationalizing it as like legitimizing riots and stuff like that, right? And in the same way, with this sort of freedom cluster, do I think that there's too much money printing? Of course. Do I think like that, non-pharmaceutical interventions and lockdowns and stuff were basically done in this destructive and hypocritical way? I do. In fact, actually, I think I tweeted at the very beginning of COVID on the potential severity of COVID, and it has killed like something like 7 million people worldwide. So it's one of these weird things where people want to either say it's not the Spanish flu. Fortunately, we didn't know it was not the Spanish flu at the beginning, but it's also not zero. But people kind of put it in this weird zone where they want to say it's either zero or infinity, and they just can't like say, okay, it's like one of the worst diseases we've had, but it's not the Spanish flu because in part we have the vaccines, right? That's where I think like a reasonable position is, which is not.
But we're not allowed reasonable positions.
We're not allowed reasonable positions because the problem is public health
because we're thrown out of the tribe.
Yeah. So exactly. Right. So the thing is, it is all, you cannot talk about, the shape, the biology of a virus is simply not something that you can reason to the right answer based on being the opposite of the other team. But if we think about the reversals, just, talk about it for a second, right? During 2020, first, it was the China virus, and, it was anybody who brought attention to it in Silicon Valley and tech, you were called a racist for saying that this could be a big thing. And, oh my God, you're so paranoid, you prepper, you loser, et cetera. Like Recode ran all these series of articles, all these journos were attacking. That was in like January, February, 2020. Okay. Then when Trump basically said, I think we should, this is not a big deal. Everybody switched sides. Okay. And suddenly the press was actually extremely, I can't believe you're against COVID testing, blah, blah, blah. And then Trump was like, let's slow the testing down and so on. And then, there's a few months where it was not known how severe the thing was. Okay. Because one hypothesis, by the way, is that, and if you look at the graph on Google of like coronavirus deaths, it is an exponential going up into about April 2020. And we're very lucky that if you go to like, COVID deaths, you look at global worldwide statistics, it's like an exponential going into April 2020. And then it kind of tops out at about like 6,000, 7,000-ish deaths per day, which is actually quite a lot. We're very lucky. It's just an empirical fact that it topped out there. It could very well have topped out at like 60 or 70,000 deaths per day.
And that could be, and again, it's not really the conversation for it, but it could have been a function of masks and lockdowns, the hammer and the dance strategy.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
It comes with a price. So
yeah, but basically, COVID's a complicated topic. Basically, the point is, it's quite possible that it hit guys like Li Wenliang, who's a healthy 30-year-old in China. Okay, just because they had a bad roll of the dice immunologically. Okay, we don't know all of the immunogenomics of the COVID response yet. Okay, people are studying this. But imagine that there's some percentage of the world that has a higher, like you have a spectrum of those people who get infected first, and they're also the ones who have the highest severity cases. And so the virus burns through those at the beginning, and then it flattens out. Okay? So I'm saying it kills all the ones that are like the most susceptible, and then right? But where it gets to, it's like, it was very much an empirical question. Anyway, point is, this is something that should have been resolved with a good public health establishment who is rational. But because they said, oh my God, you have to, they put the Grim Reaper guy on the beach with the hammer, with the sickle, and said, oh, you have to go inside. And then a week later, everybody was rioting. That essentially meant a whole group of people very justifiably lost complete trust in anything the government was saying on this, right? They just thought it was, they may not be able to understand virus biology or vaccines or what have you, but they could tell that this government was lying to them on everything else. So they're probably lying to them on this. And how can you argue against that without me going to like GenBank and showing like virus sequences? Like, I understand this because I've actually studied that science myself, right? And I can understand, yes, the state is actually false on 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 out of these 7 things, but not every single one, right? Because you can actually go in and you're like an investor, you're a researcher, you're a scientist, you can diligence that. You're like, yes, they're generally untrustworthy. I completely understand where you're coming from, but I can partially trust. And this is the problem.
Just to move us forwards a bit, we've got this construct that the state is less trusted, right? That's obvious everywhere. It's polarizing society because people don't know where the answer lies.
But people don't want to partially trust.
Technology is enabling that polarization.
Well, that's the thing. People don't want to partially trust. They want to just either trust or not trust. And
yeah, exactly.
That's what happens.
How does your nation state play into this, and how's it defined? Your digital nation state.
Yeah. So what happens? Basically, putting all the pieces together, people are more friendly with folks 3,000 miles away. They're closer in digital space than they are, culturally to those people who are their next door neighbors. Okay, increasingly. B, the U.S. is no longer a single nation state. Arguably, it never was. But let's say post 1950, it had kind of been fused into a nation. The Poles and the Italians and so on. Everybody was kind of like one like country. Arguably, is like the most unified it had been. Okay. But now it's a binational state at a minimum. It's blue versus red. Okay, it's like literally like Sunni versus Shiite or Hutu versus Tutsi, because Democrats only marry other Democrats and Republicans only marry other Republicans. People will marry across race, but not